Some major breaking news here. According to ABC News, Trump's former chief of staff Mark Meadows has accepted an immunity deal with special counsel Jack Smith, signaling yet another flip against Donald Trump. He's reportedly spoken with Smith's team at least 3 times this year, including once before a federal grand jury, which came only after Meadows was granted immunity to testify under oath. And it seems to have paid dividends for prosecutors, considering Meadows reportedly informed Smith's team that he reportedly told Trump in the weeks after the 2020 presidential election that the allegations of significant voting fraud coming to them were baseless. Meadows also told federal investigators that Trump was being dishonest with the public when he first claimed to have won the election only hours after polls closed on November 3rd, 2020, before final results were in. Quote, "Obviously we didn't win," a source quoted Meadows as telling Smith's team in hindsight. And all of this revelatory information comes in stark contrast to what Trump himself was saying about the election, which is that he truly believed it to be rigged and stolen. This testimony by Mark Meadows would directly refute those claims, considering it would give prosecutors direct, first-hand evidence that Trump knew better, but made the conscious decision to lie anyway for the express purpose of overturning the 2020 election. Consider, too, Mark Meadows is a really big fish when it comes to this prosecution. There is no doubt that he has a major target on his back as far as federal prosecutors are concerned, meaning for him to enter into a cooperation agreement must have meant that he could offer extremely valuable testimony for those prosecutors. And considering Meadows was the go-between for nearly every single other figure in Trump's criminal enterprise, I think it's safe to say he absolutely knows where all the bodies are buried. Granted, we can't say for sure that Mark Meadows is in the clear. He's also a co-defendant in the Fulton County, Georgia trial, and while a number of defendants have entered into plea agreements with Fani Willis's team, thus far Meadows isn't one of them, at least not publicly. So it remains to be seen how this plays out, but there does exist the possibility that if Meadows is able to slither away in the DC trial, that he might still be held to account in Fulton County, Georgia. Although I should note that things do get a bit complicated when it comes to these two separate prosecutions. Normally, if federal prosecutors secured damning testimony from a witness, in this case Mark Meadows, they could share that testimony with another jurisdiction that was prosecuting that witness. So if Meadows was being prosecuted in federal court and state court, for example, Jack Smith could file a motion with the chief judge in federal district court, who has supervisory authority over the grand jury, to share that material with a different jurisdiction, namely Fulton County, which the chief judge would effectively be guaranteed to approve. And this way, Fani Willis could use Meadows' testimony in the federal grand jury against him in state trial. And all of this is done under seal, by the way, so we wouldn't even know that this was happening. But because he went into the grand jury with the promise of immunity, that may mean that Jack Smith wouldn't share it with Fani Willis, or it may mean that he did because he was only promised immunity in federal court. Again, all of this remains to be seen, given that we're in pretty uncharted territory here. But with that said, what is clear is that this is unequivocally bad news for Donald Trump, given the sheer proximity that Meadows had to him. And it adds to the avalanche of bad news that Trump's been contending with just in the last few days. In Fulton County, prosecutors flipped Scott Hall, followed by Sidney Powell, followed by Kenneth Chesebro, followed by Jenna Ellis. And it's increasingly possible that we may see every co-defendant flip on him, a prospect that my Legal Breakdown co-host Glenn Kirshner pointed out in our most recent episode. Do you think there's any likelihood that all of the co-defendants in Fulton County flip on Trump? Because right now, Fani Willis is batting 100% in terms of flipping defendants ahead of their immediate trials, at least.
Yeah, I do. I think there's a very good chance that most or perhaps all of the ultimately 19 co-defendants will end up pleading guilty. So first of all, remember, you still have that whole lower tier of fake electors, right? They weren't the kind of players. They weren't the kind of big ticket sort of, doing big ticket damage to our nation the way Trump, Mark Meadows, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, John Eastman, Jeffrey Clark, the corrupt DOJ official, and some of the others were doing. So I have a feeling you're going to see these low-level defendants begin to plead out, perhaps some to sentences of probation, which is what Powell and Chesebro were offered and accepted. And we can talk about some of the challenges that poses. But I think you're going to see most and maybe even all defendants, perhaps with the exception of Donald Trump himself, end up pleading guilty because, the writing's on the wall. D.A. Willis has been really strategic in the people she has opted to try to flip first. She got that bail bondsman, Scott, what was his name? Scott Hall, because she knew that Scott Hall was basically in league with Sidney Powell in their breach of the Coffee County voting equipment. So Scott Hall flipped, which helped her flip Sidney Powell, which helped her flip Kenneth Chesebro. And it's really a vindication. This is a vindication of the tactical decisions that Fani Willis not only is making in who she's trying to flip, but in her tactical decision to bring a massive, sprawling 19 co-defendant RICO conspiracy case, because, Brian, we just saw Kenneth Chesebro go into court and plead guilty to a felony conspiracy charge, proving that DA Willis had it right the whole time.
And of course, to see more episodes of The Legal Breakdown, make sure to subscribe to this channel. And so while it shouldn't come as a surprise that Trump's allies are now flipping on him in 2 different jurisdictions, it does enter us into a new phase of these prosecutions, where the very people who conspired with and aided Trump in his schemes are now serving as the very people who will take him down. Because sometimes, even in a court system rife with inequality, there does still exist some small degree of poetic justice. There's also some poetic justice in the fact that normally it is Donald Trump himself who dumps people the moment they lose their usefulness. He said that Paul Manafort, his campaign chairman, came into the campaign very late and was with us for a short period of time. He called George Papadopoulos, his foreign policy advisor, a low-level volunteer. He said of Gordon Sondland, his EU ambassador and campaign donor, "I have not spoken to him much. This is not a man I know well." He said Michael Cohen, his own lawyer and fixer, did a, quote, tiny fraction of his legal work. And just days ago, he distanced himself from Sidney Powell, writing, "Despite the fake news reports to the contrary, and without even reaching out to ask the Trump campaign, Miss Powell was not my attorney and never was. In fact, she would have been conflicted." And the list goes on, but the point is clear. Trump will throw you under the bus the moment he feels you become politically inconvenient for him. And so the fact that he's now the body under the bus is quite the turnaround for an increasingly isolated Donald Trump. But the reason is clear. These people are not willing to give up their lives, their families, and their very freedom for Donald Trump, notwithstanding the fact that he would obviously never do the same for them. And so while it's one thing to stand by Trump while he's bloviating about the election from inside of the White House, it is something entirely different when these people are able to be sentenced to years behind bars, and the guy who directed this scheme is himself facing the prospect of living out the rest of his life in a prison cell. Which is why we are all but certain to see even more plea deals and cooperation agreements across these jurisdictions, signaling that Trump's prospect in these cases will continue to become more and more grim. Trump was the king of transactional relationships. Now he's finally getting to experience them from the other side. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to the channel and do your part to help grow the progressive media ecosystem. I don't do sponsorships or paid ads, I won't ask for money, but just subscribing to this channel goes a really long way, and it helps get the message out to more people. The subscribe button is right here on this screen. You can also subscribe to my Spanish language channel, which I made to reach those crucial Spanish-speaking voters. That link is on the screen too. And finally, if you want to listen to my audio podcast, you can follow that link as well. Thanks so much for watching.